fire alone can't lift anything off the ground. Most people who've tried holding cloth over an open flame already know why. It catches, it chars, it curls at the edges, and whatever dream they had of flight disappears in a ribbon of black smoke. But in the summer of 1783, two brothers in a small paper mill in Annonay, France proved that fire and fabric, combined correctly, could defy gravity, and that the thing separating failure from flight was a single, invisible principle most people hadn't thought to consider. The constraint was total. No engines, no synthetic materials, no compressed gases, no modern chemistry. Just the oldest tool humanity ever had. And whatever fabric could be stitched together by hand. It sounds almost too simple to work. It isn't. The first instinct, and the first mistake, is the obvious one: hold the silk directly over the flame. The heat is intense, immediate, and the silk doesn't rise, it burns. The fire isn't trapped beneath it, it's eating through it. And all that energy bleeds sideways into the open air, carrying nothing with it but ash and a sharp smell of scorched thread. That failure is informative, though, because it reveals the actual problem. The fire itself isn't the mechanism, it's just the energy source. What actually lifts something is not the flame, but what the flame does to the air beneath a sealed envelope of fabric. Here's the principle stripped clean. Hot air is less dense than the cold air surrounding it. When air heats up, its molecules move faster, spread further apart, and the same volume of hot air weighs measurably less than an equal volume of cold air at rest. That mass difference, multiplied across a large enough enclosed space, creates a buoyant force. The same physics that makes a cork rise in water, except the water is the atmosphere, and the cork is a silk bag filled with air that's been heated well above the temperature of everything around it. The fire doesn't need to touch the fabric. The fire needs to heat the air inside a closed pocket of fabric, and that pocket needs to be large enough that the mass it displaces exceeds the combined weight of the envelope, the rigging, and whatever is suspended beneath it. That changes everything about the approach. The silk has to be shaped, not draped, not held open, but sealed into a continuous envelope with as few gaps as possible, so that the hot air accumulates inside rather than escaping through every loose seam. Getting the shape right takes longer than expected. A rough sphere works in theory, but getting fabric to hold that shape without a rigid frame requires careful cutting, panels that taper toward the top, that bow outward at the equator. Seams stitched tight enough that pressure from inside pushes the fabric out, rather than letting hot air jet through needle holes. Beneath that envelope, a fire basket is rigged at a controlled distance, close enough to feed heat up into the balloon's mouth, far enough that the flame's direct reach doesn't contact the lower panels. The throat of the balloon, the open bottom where heat enters, stays wide enough to feed the air volume inside without letting cooled air flood back in too quickly. The first inflation attempt is quiet, almost anticlimactic. The fabric shifts, tightens, begins to take shape, and then settles. It rises maybe a foot, strains against the tethering ropes with a kind of nervous tension, and sinks back down the moment the heat source wavers. The problem isn't the principle is working. The problem is scale and leakage. Thin, loosely stitched fabric lets heat escape through the weave itself, and even small tears at the seams vent enough pressure to kill the lift before it builds. The fix is methodical thicker panels, where the internal pressure is highest, reinforced stitching across the broadest curves, and a more sustained, steady fire rather than a hot surge that spikes and falls. The real Montgolfier brothers, Joseph, Michel and Jacques Tyne, discovered the same bottleneck in the months before their first public demonstration. Their early envelopes were silk-lined with paper, a pairing that sounds fragile but worked, because the paper helped seal the weave against the constant pressure of hot air pushing outward, reducing the leakage that had made their first models fall short. They were paper manufacturers by trade, and that background turned out to matter more than any formal engineering education either of them had. You use what you know. Second inflation attempt, seams reinforced, fire steadier, the balloon's throat held open at the correct angle, and something different happens. The envelope doesn't just swell, it hardens into shape, the fabric pulling taut from the inside as the heated air builds pressure, the balloon lifting with a kind of slow, inevitable authority that the first attempt never had. The tether ropes go from slack to bar tight. Released, the balloon doesn't dart upward. It rises the way something heavy lifts when it's finally overcome its own weight, smooth and deliberate and enormous against the sky. That is the payoff that the physics always promised. On June 5, 1783, Joseph, Michel and Jacques Etienne Montgolfier demonstrated this exact principle publicly for the first time in Annonay, lifting an unmanned balloon approximately 6,000 feet into the air, watched by a crowd that had no framework for what they were seeing because nothing had ever done it before. Later that same year in September, they flew a sheep, a duck, and a rooster in a wicker basket beneath a balloon at Versailles, in front of King Louis XVI of France, to prove the air at altitude was breathable. The animals landed safely. 2 months after that, in November 1783, the first human beings to fly in a balloon lifted off from the grounds of the Shah, 2 de la Muette in Paris, Pelle, Tre de Rosier and the Marquis d'Arlandes, tethered at first, then free, and travelled roughly 5 miles across the city at an altitude of about 3,000 feet. The entire flight lasted 25 minutes. The silk they used wasn't ordinary fabric. It was cotton taffeta reinforced with alum to improve its fire resistance, and stitched in a series of alternating panels that gave the balloon its characteristic teardrop shape. The fire basket burned straw and wool, chosen because they produced a dense, hot smoke. The brothers initially believed it was the smoke itself that caused lift, not the heat, which explains why their early fuel choices looked so strange to engineers who came after them. That misconception didn't stop it from working. The physics were real even when the explanation was wrong. What the whole process reveals, from burnt silk to sustained flight, is that the critical variable was never the fire. It was containment. The fire is easy. Any open flame provides heat. The hard part is holding that heat in one place. Scaling the container large enough that the mass difference between the air inside and the air outside generates a force greater than the weight of everything you've built. Get that ratio right, and gravity stops being an absolute rule. It becomes a negotiation. Most people who held silk over a flame and watched it burn would have concluded the idea was impossible. Would you have looked at that charred edge and found the principle underneath it, or called it done?